A modern structural engineer awakens in chains as his prison wagon starts falling off a cliff. His cheat is simple: every bridge, wall, and fortress reveals its fatal flaw to him. With timber and 1 week, he can protect Kale's people, build a home, and make an empire bleed. His welcome package included an iron collar, a thunderstorm, and history's worst suspension design. Welcome to the Northern Trade Route. The Northern Trade Route was a slippery mudslide wrapped around a bottomless gorge. 0 guardrails. Total workplace safety violation. His traveling companions made everything worse. Starving peasants, shivering elves, and guys who look like they haven't seen a bar of soap since the Bronze Age, and they were all chained beside him. A guard ordered the chained prisoners to move faster. Naturally, management answered structural failure with more force. The guards pushed the failing wooden axle harder through wet mud. 3, 2, 1. And there goes the load-bearing pin. Physics did not care about anyone's magical empire. The guards cursed the wagon and blamed the equipment. It was classic middle management, blaming tools instead of decisions. He was about to give him a sarcastic lecture on weight distribution. But then the wind shifted and the bird stopped making noise. You don't need a college degree to know what complete silence in a forest means. It means something is looking at you. The guard threatened anyone who slowed the wagon. And suddenly, bandit arrow cut through the rain with perfect precision. The ambush erupted before anyone could process the warning. Panic spread through the chained prisoners inside the 3-ton wooden box. The wagon teetered beside the cliff while everyone screamed. He just started looking for the weakest link in his chains. If he was going to die today, it's sure as hell not going to be from a traffic accident on a fantasy cliff road. You test a chain the way you test anything. 1 link at a time. You ask each one how much it doesn't want to be here. Most of them are committed. One of them is just tired. The weak link is 2 rings from the wall bolt. Classic stress concentration. Whoever forged this chain never heard of work hardening. Outside, another guard went down. Not his problem right now. And then the wagon shifted. 3 tons of bad engineering suddenly discovered what gravity thought about cliffs. He lost the chain. He also lost his footing. He briefly lost his sense of which direction was down. He stopped thinking like a prisoner and started reading the wagon's failing structure. When a cart tilts toward a cliff, the door is no longer an exit. It's a diving board. He looked at the door latch instead. Raw iron poured into a sand mold, never tempered. The installer put the shear pin in backwards. He could feel it. The right angle was 37 degrees from vertical. He knew because he used to calculate this stuff for a living. He lined up his boot heel, applied a force vector at the precise weak point. In layman's terms, he kicked it really specifically. The pin bent. Didn't break, of course, it didn't. Outside, the last guard made a very reasonable career decision and ran. The wagon slid another 8 inches toward the edge. He heard the right wheel leave the ground. Okay, different approach. The hinge side. The hinge bolts are only threaded 4 millimeters deep into rotten wood, not the lock. Never fight the lock when the surrounding frame is weaker. Attack the frame supporting it, because rotten wood cannot defend iron. It's the oldest mistake in the book. He put his back against the opposite wall, both feet flat on the door, and he pushed, evenly distributed, the way load is supposed to work. The first 2 bolts held. The third one gave up its entire philosophy of existence. The door swung outward over the gorge. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, did the math, decided not to comment. He grabbed the door frame, shifted his weight to the left, stepped out onto the tongue of the wagon like he was getting off a bus. 12 other people watched him do that. Nobody followed. The wagon went over the edge 30 seconds later. He watched from the cliff path. It made a very structural sound on the way down. Then a bandit stepped in front of him. Big guy, axe. The standard fantasy package. He hefted the axe off his shoulder, slow. The way you pick up a tool you've used so many times. The axe moved like part of his arm, not like a staged threat. Just wait. Finding its balance, he said something threatening. Probably. He did not yet speak the local dialect, but the axe translated well enough. He pushed his glasses up, looked him in the eye. He told the axeman that one skill worked in every world. He could fix things, and that confidence bought half a second. The half second where the axe could have gone either way. He later learned that in that half second, he was not deciding whether to kill him. He was deciding whether he was worth the energy of being surprised. He did not swing the axe. That was new. He just looked at him the way a dog looks at a card trick. That's when someone behind him shouted. Every head turned at once. Across the gorge, one rope bridge, 3 tons of stolen empire, cargo waiting on the near side, and the main load cable was fraying. Someone had already tried to fix it. They had wrapped more rope around the fraying section, which is roughly equivalent to putting a bandage on a broken femur. The bandit leader found him before he found her. Small, quiet, the kind of quiet. That means she's already counted every way this conversation could end. She pointed at the bridge, then at him, then at the cargo. It was the most efficient job interview he had ever had. He walked to the cable, ran his thumb along the twist, counted the broken strands, 11. The cable had 60% of its rated capacity left. If the local rope maker rated it correctly to begin with, which, given everything else he had seen that day, was not a bet he was prepared to make. 3 trips, not 1. Lightest load first. Nobody moved. They looked at their boss. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then she nodded. First trip. Rope, tools, the lightest crates. The cable held, of course, it held. That's what 60% means. Second trip. Medium weight. Weapons, armor, the mid-size chests. That's when he saw it. 2 more strands gone, which meant the last trip. The heavy iron chests was no longer a math problem. It was a prayer. He needed to redistribute the load. He had 8 minutes, a knife, some leftover rope, and the worst assistant he had ever worked with. He gave him very specific instructions. He held the wrong end of the rope for 4 of those 8 minutes. He chose not to calculate the impact of that. Last trip, the heavy chests, half the weight of the entire haul, loaded onto a cable with 40% of its structural life left. Nobody talked. The first chest reached the quarter span. The whole bridge took a slow breath downward. Exactly the breath he had calculated, a few centimeters deeper than he would have liked. Halfway across, the damaged section took the peak load. He heard it. 1 strand let go, then a pause that lasted slightly too long, then a second somewhere he couldn't see. The deck dropped the width of a finger and held. Don't run. Running shifts the load laterally. You will absolutely die if you run. The last chest touched the other side. A mountain bandit with arms like bridge cables caught it. But then, the main cable snapped half a second after the final chest landed. He looked at where the bridge used to be, took off his glasses, cleaned them, on the least dirty part of his sleeve, put them back on. The bandit leader was standing next to him. She said something. He still didn't speak the language, but tone is universal. She was asking what he needed. A forge, a decent chisel, a week without anyone trying to kill him. He kept the last one to himself. The camp was a masterclass in everything a structural engineer spends their career preventing. He counted 11 critical failure points before they reached the gate. The watchtower had a lean of about 8 degrees. In the rain, softened soil with no cross-bracing. He gave it 4 more days at current conditions. They showed him to the forge. He should not have been surprised, but he was a little. No forced air system, clay body with a thermal efficiency he would estimate at around 12%. The bellows had a crack in the leather. That was venting half the pressure, 12%. He stood there for a while. The locals thought he was inspecting it. He was grieving. Then he stopped, because there was work to do. He did not start with the sword blanks or the tools they wanted. He started with the forge itself. You fix the system before you fix the output. The bellows was next. Wetted leather swells and self-seals if you pack the crack correctly. It's not elegant, but it works. Working beats elegance every time. 4 hours later, the forge hit a temperature had probably never seen in its life. Something in the clay cracked from the heat. A good crack. The kind that means it's working. He worked through the night. Nobody asked him to. Nobody told him to stop. He thought they were afraid of what might happen if they interrupted. He heated a billet until the color told him it was ready. Not the temperature, the color. Steel speaks in a language you can read across. A dark room. If you spent enough years listening, then the hammer. You don't hit steel hard, you hit it correctly. Each blow moves metal exactly as much as the blow before or the edge comes out crooked. Consistency is the whole job. Quench, then the slow part. Grinding the bevel by hand against a wet stone. Checking the angle against the light again, until the edge stopped reflecting anything at all. A true edge is invisible. That's how you know. At dawn, after a full night of fire iron and grinding, he had a chisel. Just a chisel. Nobody writes songs about chisels. But this one had a correct bevel angle, differential hardening on the edge. and a center of gravity he had calculated by hand. In this world, that made it a minor miracle. The leader picked it up, didn't say anything, ran her thumb across the edge the right way. That told him she had been cut by a bad tool, and learned from it. Then the big one took it from her. The axeman from yesterday, he still hadn't decided what he was. He held it wrong. He watched where his thumb was going. He did not say anything. Then he found the edge. He did not make a sound. Big men rarely do. He just looked at his thumb, then at the chisel, then at him. In that order. He handed the chisel back, 2 hands. That was probably the most important moment of his first week. Nobody saw it but them. That was fine. Structural changes don't need an audience. The leader gave him a tent. It had a hole in the roof. He fixed the hole. Then he fixed the drainage around the tent. Then he noticed the drainage was connected to a larger problem. A week later, he had fixed 7 things and discovered 43 more. This is called engineering. Day 3, he measured the tower. Lean again. It had moved another ½ degree overnight. The soil under the northeast footing was fully saturated. He found the leader, did what he always do. When he did not have the words for something, he demonstrated. She looked at the tower, she looked at the mud. Then she looked at him with the expression of someone who has survived long enough to know that problems you can't see are worse than problems you can. She gave him 2 men and a pile of timber scraps. He gave her a list of what he actually needed. She looked at the list and gave him 1 more man. The storm hit at midnight. He had been awake for 2 hours watching it come in from the east. He knew what a load amplification event looks like. The tower guard was asleep. He knew because he could hear him from the ground. And then the first real gust hit and the tower moved. Not a lot, about 4 centimeters at the top. 4 centimeters at the top means 40 centimeters at the base. If the footing gives. He went out. The rain hit, like a decision someone else had made for him. 40 meters of open mud between his tent and the tower. He walked it at the pace of a man going to fix a printer. Cross-bracing, that's all it was. 2 diagonal members transferred the lateral load to the windward foundation. Any first-year student knows this. This world just hadn't gotten to first-year students yet. He climbed the leaning side first. Counterintuitive, he knew. But the upper connection point is where the lateral load wants to go. You meet the load where it lives. The guard woke up when he climbed past him. He said something, probably. Who are you? And why are you on his watchtower in a storm? Classic. He pointed at the brace connection point. Then at the storm. Then at the tower. Then at the ground. He helped him. First diagonal member. Bottom and braced against the windward foundation. Top end lashed to the upper junction. 1 triangle. Triangles are the only shape that doesn't argue. Wet rope is stronger than dry rope if you know how it behaves. It bites down as it dries. He wrapped the junction the way the load wanted, not the way that looked neat. Neat is for daylight. Second diagonal, opposite side. The guard held it in place while he lashed. He still had no idea what they were building. He held it anyway. He was choosing to call that trust and not exhaustion. The storm peaked around 3 in the morning. The tower swayed. The new braces took the load. He sat at the base and listened. At dawn, the tower was still standing. He knew that sounded like a low bar, but in his week here, 2 other structures had not cleared it. He was sitting at the base of the tower, still soaked. He heard the tower guard shout about Imperial scouts below. Their flag colors matched the convoy searching for its stolen cargo. Without the reinforced tower, the scouts would have approached and seen. They would have entered while everyone slept beside 43 unresolved problems. The leader came out to see what the shouting was about. She looked down at the scouts, then up at the tower, then at him sitting at the base of it, soaked to the bone. She said 1 word. He learned later it meant something like why. He answered the only way his limited vocabulary allowed. He picked up a stick, drew in the mud a tower, a sight line, 2 dots representing the scouts, an arrow showing where they'd come from without being seen, and a cross where the camp would have been. She looked at the diagram for a long time, then at the scouts, still visible in the valley, then at him. She said something else. This one he did not need a translator for. Next problem. The dead water in the center of camp had been there so long it had a name. He knew because people stopped walking through it the same way. You stopped walking through the part of the office where someone cried once. Procedural memory. Nobody remembered why in his second week 2 people got sick. Not dramatically, not fantasy plague sick, just the kind of tired and feverish that drains people slowly like a bad battery. He spent the morning tracing where they slept, where they ate, where they drank. He called the method contact tracing, though nobody else recognized the idea. No healer or commander had yet linked sickness to contaminated water. The water source was uphill from the dead pool by 12 meters. The soil between them was saturated clay. The math was not complicated. He went to the leader with a handful of mud from the seepage path and a cup of water from the drinking source. She looked at both for a long time. Then she called the healer. The healer was older than the camp. He had a staff with bones on it and the kind of authority that comes from being the only person around who confidently explains things nobody can see. He recognized the job description immediately. He explained at some length that the two sick people had offended a water spirit. The treatment was a specific combination of herbs, a fire ritual, and avoiding the north side of camp for 3 days. It held together the way wrong things do, every piece fitting perfectly. Wrong, but consistent. He did not argue. He chose the downhill edge of the dead pool, and he put a spade into ground that had been holding still water longer than anyone in this camp had been alive. The channel followed the grade, not his preference. Water doesn't care about straight lines. Halfway down, he hit a buried stone the size of a sleeping dog. He dug around it. Arguing with geology is a beginner's mistake. Then, the moment he had been digging toward the standing water, found the new channel, and for the first time in years, it moved. He did not argue with the healer. Argument requires a shared framework. Instead, he kept digging. It took 2 days. A drainage channel running from the dead pool down the natural grade out through a gap in the camp wall he opened in the northeast corner. The soil dried. The seepage stopped. A week later, the two sick people were standing up. The healer said his ritual had worked. He said nothing, because both methods had helped. Technically, his ritual had bought time. His drainage removed the source. The healer went to the leader that evening. He knew because he was close enough to hear the tone, if not the words. The healer's tone warned that the outsider was becoming dangerous. He was recalibrating the bellows on the forge. She watched him work for a while before she spoke. That was new, usually. She just said the thing. She said something he almost understood. 3 weeks in, he had maybe 60 words. But he had all the verbs for things being broken and things being fixed, priorities. She explained the healer's fear as carefully as her limited words allowed. The old man believed the engineer was pulling at society's roots. He answered that those roots had already become rotten. Kale almost smiled, and he chose to credit the joke. She still allowed the healer to continue performing his rituals. He did not expect her to. Good leaders don't dismantle systems that work just because a better one arrived. They run them in parallel until the numbers speak for themselves. End of week 3. The camp had not fallen down, burned down, or been found by scouts. These were his metrics. He had no other metrics. That was fine. Week 4, he stopped fixing things. He started building them. The plan was a blast furnace. Not a good one, not by any standard he had held in his previous life, but one that could reach temperatures the existing forge could only dream about. In this world that made it a weapon, he needed refractory clay. Clay that doesn't crack at high temperatures because its crystal structure handles thermal stress properly. The stuff holding the existing forge together was about as refractory as a wet sock. He found a vein of it 3 meters down behind the northeast wall inside the excavation he had opened for the drainage channel. The drainage ditch had accidentally exposed it. He called it foresight. The ditch, if asked, would have called it luck. The build took 8 days. 63 bricks of refractory clay, hand-formed and sun-dried. First, then kiln-fired in batches in the existing forge before going into the structure. He bootstrapped the system using the system. On day 3, the big one showed up, with a bucket of refractory clay and no explanation. Bren had been watching him process the refractory clay. He had figured out which clay was needed and gone to collect more. He did not comment on this either. By day 6, he had 4 people helping. None of them were assigned. They just appeared. People are drawn to things being built correctly. It's instinctive, like watching someone solve a puzzle they didn't know they were stuck on. Day 8, first firing. He brought the temperature up slowly to slowly. Some part of him thought that part of him was wrong. Thermal shock is patient. It will find the weak point in the crystal structure. If you rush. By the 4th hour, everything was right. The color was right. The sound was right. The iron was loaded and glowing. Every number on his mental checklist had a tick beside it. It cracked. Not immediately. It waited until the temperature was perfect and the iron was loaded. But then the furnace cracked exactly when he believed the firing was perfect. The crack started at the waste junction where he changed the taper. It ran upward through 3 courses of brick before he had finished inhaling. White heat venting through a line that should not have existed. Everyone looked at him. The ones who had helped build it. The ones who had just been watching. Even the healer, from a distance. He looked at the crack. The crack pattern was a gift. Thermal shock always signs its work. Vertical propagation from the waste junction where the taper began. He had changed the geometry without adjusting the clay formula. Rookie mistake. He had been a rookie here for 4 weeks. He spent the rest of that day collecting grog. Crushed. Fired. Ceramic mixed back into the new clay batch. It interrupts crack propagation pathways at the microstructural level. In this world, people would have called it witchcraft. He called it material science. He rebuilt in 5 days. Nobody asked if he was sure. He thought that surprised him more than the first crack did. Second firing, he brought the temperature up. Over 6 hours. 2 hours slower than the first time. Patience is the cheapest engineering material there is. This time, he washed one spot, the waste junction. The exact place that had failed. The temperature climbed past where it cracked before, and he made himself keep breathing. It held. What came out of it was iron, not the gray, crumbly, stress-fractured pig iron the camp had been using. This was denser, darker. It rang when you dropped it. The big one picked up the new iron, held it for a while, put it back down very carefully. He had spent his whole life working with the other kind. He knew the difference. The leader came at dusk, looked at the furnace. Still running, looked at the new iron. Then she said something he understood completely. For the first time, every word landed clearly. Then Cale asked what he intended to build next. It was the best sentence he had ever heard. He told her his name. She repeated it back slightly wrong. He told her that was fine. He had been mispronouncing hers for 2 weeks. Her name was Cale, 2 syllables. The second one dropped low. He had been calling her something that apparently meant the woman who decides things with fire. She said that was also acceptable. She asked why he had not tried to leave. It was a fair question. The chain from the convoy had come off his neck 3 weeks ago. He had been sleeping with the door of his tent open since day 2. He told her the truth, which was that he had looked at every road out of these mountains and calculated the survival probability of a foreigner with no money, no local contacts, no language, and a collar scar that announces exactly what category of person he used to be. The number wasn't good. She was quiet for a moment. Cale quietly observed that survival was not his true reason. She already understood him better than most longtime colleagues ever had. He thought about that for a while. The honest answer was that there was a blast furnace here that didn't exist anywhere else within 100 miles. He had built the furnace and wanted to discover what it could make. He told her what he wanted to build next. A wall, not a stockade. A real wall with foundations, drainage, and a geometric profile that deflects projectiles instead of absorbing them. She looked at the drawing, then at the camp around them, then at him. Bandits don't build walls, she said. They move. He said, that's why you're always losing. She did not answer for a long time. He waited. You learn to wait in this line of work. Clients always need more time than engineers to arrive at conclusions that engineering already reached 3 weeks ago. She finally asked how long the wall would require. He told her, with the existing labor, 3 months for a perimeter wall that would hold against a mounted assault. 1 month. If she could get him 40 more people. 2 weeks. If she could get him 60 and let him redesign the camp layout at the same time. She asked where the 60 people would come from. He said that was her problem. She said that was a very confident answer for someone who arrived here as cargo. He said the cargo had references. Now, the references were a watchtower still standing, drainage channel that hadn't killed anyone lately, a furnace producing iron that rang when you dropped it, and one very large man who now brought him clay without being asked. She went quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet, the planning kind. He left her to it, went back to the furnace. He had iron to process and a wall to design, and approximately 43 problems left on a list that kept getting longer. The kind of longer that means you're learning. She came back at dawn with her answer, and someone he had not seen before. Small man rode dirty, carrying news the way people carry news. In a world without printing presses, badly and urgently. 3 camps below them had been cleared by the Empire in the last 2 weeks. Not raided, cleared. The distinction mattered. Cleared means no survivors left to move on. It means the Empire wasn't sending tax collectors anymore. It was sending a policy. People from those camps were moving. Some were heading down to surrender. Most were heading up. Up meant them. Cale looked at him. He looked at the camp. The camp currently had room for 47 people and was already housing 63. His wall proposal had just promoted itself from a good idea to a deadline. He told Cale he needed to start today. She said she had already told the big man. He said he did not know his name yet. She looked at him the way you look at someone who's been working with a person for weeks and doesn't know their name. His name was Bren. He had been with the camp for 11 years. He was also apparently the only person who'd ever survived a direct argument with the previous camp leader, which explained some things. They started arriving that afternoon. Not a flood, a trickle that did not stop. Trickling water doesn't look dangerous until you notice it's been going for 6 hours. He set up an intake process. Cale watched him do it with an expression he was starting to recognize. It meant he was not going to do it this way, but he could not immediately explain why this way is wrong. Skills first, then condition, then attitude. Last. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear distort attitudes, while skills remain. Skills were what survived after everything else had been stripped away. Bren helped without being asked. He couldn't read his symbols, but he understood the categories instantly. He sorted people faster than he could record them. He filed that away under underestimated assets. By evening, they had 81 new people, 12 with forge or smithing experience, 9 with construction backgrounds, 4 who turned out to be military engineers from a dissolved imperial unit, which he chose to interpret as a gift from whatever local deity handles irony. 4 military engineers in a bandit camp, because the Empire had dissolved their unit for budgetary restructuring, which is what empires call it, when they decide that paying soldiers is less efficient than letting the mountains deal with them. He found them at midnight, sitting around a fire, drawing in the dirt, not just drawing load-bearing calculations in a system he did not recognize, but could read in about 3 minutes. They stayed up until dawn. Their system used compression triangles where he used shear diagrams. Different notation, same physics. The universe does not care what language you describe it in. It just keeps doing the same things. By the time the sun came up, they had a complete wall design. 47 meters of perimeter, 3 gatehouse positions, internal drainage integrated into the foundation layer, and a sightline geometry that covered every approach from the valley below. 5 engineers working in the dirt by firelight had built a complete settlement plan overnight. He looked at the 4 of them. They looked at him. Bren looked at all of them with the expression of a man who has seen many things, but has never before seen 5 people argue about drainage gradients until sunrise. Cale brought them food at some point. He did not know when it was there, and then it was gone. And then they were still talking. He filed that under non-verbal communications and got back to work. Construction started the next morning. They cleared the wall line and dug the foundation trench, and got 3 meters of the northern section up before he found the problem. The problem was underground. Of course, it was. Structural problems that aren't underground aren't structural problems. They are interior design choices made by someone who doesn't understand loads. An old water channel, seasonal runoff, probably. The walls it had carved through the subsoil were soft enough to squeeze with 2 fingers. You don't put a wall on top of something you can squeeze with 2 fingers. They had 2 options: dig deeper and pour rubble fill until they hit something solid, which would add 2 weeks, or reroute the wall line around it, which would add 4 days and give them a better geometry on the eastern approach. The reroute cost time, but it also strengthened the eastern approach. He told Cale they needed 4 more days. She asked what happened. He said the ground had a previous engagement they hadn't consulted about. She translated that to Bren. He was not sure what he heard, but he started digging in the new location before he finished speaking. Day 6 of construction, north section was up and stable. The 4 days had become 3 because someone had thought to pre-cut the facing stones while they were rerouting, which meant the only person who truly wasted time was him for not thinking of it first. To finish the east section, he needed to survey the ridge outside the camp, the ridge that was technically in the territory of something that wasn't them. Bren came without being asked. He had stopped noticing how often Bren did that. The mountain had better bones than he had credited. What looked like random terrain from inside the camp was from the outside, a natural fortress that someone had managed to use at about 15% of its potential. There was a secondary ridge line to the northeast. That created a natural blind spot in their watchtower coverage. Someone standing there could observe the camp for hours without being seen. He knew because he stood there for an hour. It could be fixed with one outpost position, and a signal system he could build in a day. He added it to the list. The list was now longer than the original 43. The list had developed ambitions. On the way back, he saw them down in the valley. Empire survey team, not scouts. Survey teams carry different equipment and move differently. Survey teams are planning something. Survey teams come before roads. Roads come before armies. He had never been in a medieval fantasy world before, but he had been in enough infrastructure projects to know what that sequence means. He got back to camp and went straight to Kale. For the first time since he had arrived, he needed her to explain something to him instead of the other way around. He showed her what he had drawn of the survey team. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she said one word. He knew early. She had a plan. It had been forming for quite some time. He had been so busy solving engineering problems that he had not noticed. He was solving them inside someone else's larger plan. There was a minor lordship in the valley below, House Thrennick. Old money, reduced circumstances, a formal imperial charter. They could no longer afford to defend independently. They needed something to put between themselves and the Empire's new interest in this mountain range. They needed legitimacy. A bandit camp can be cleared. A legitimate settlement under a chartered lord cannot, not without paperwork. That takes longer than the Empire is willing to wait. Bureaucracy as a defensive structure. He had never loved paperwork more. She had been building this plan for 2 years. The furnace, the wall, the refugees as future population for a chartered settlement. The survey team turned Kale's patient strategy into an immediate deadline. The survey team made the threat urgent enough for House Thrennick to commit. Everything he had been doing was load-bearing, just not the kind he usually built. He asked her why she hadn't told him. Kale admitted she had hidden the plan because he would optimize it. He confessed that she was completely right about that danger. Given the chance, he would optimize the humanity out of politics. She was right. Given the chance, he would have turned her political architecture into an engineering problem and optimized the humanity right out of it. He went back and told her the wall would be done in 12 days. That the outpost position on the northeast ridge would be done in 2. And that if she was going to negotiate with House Thrennick, she should do it before the survey team finished their work. Afterward, every deal would be made under pressure instead of strategy. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said something he had to ask her to repeat twice. He asked twice because he understood the second answer and needed certainty. Kale reminded him that he was no longer her prisoner. In truth, his imprisonment had ended several weeks earlier. She had assumed the open tent and missing chain made that obvious. The chain that had come off 3 weeks ago. 60 words in the local language, all of them about things being broken. The list that kept getting longer, and the furnace still running that nobody had asked him to build. 12 days, he told her. 12 days. 11 days and 7 hours later, the wall was done. Bran ran his hand along the facing stone of the east section, didn't say anything. He had come to understand that when Bran didn't say anything, that was the review. The 4 engineers held a technical review that lasted 2 hours, and involved a significant amount of pointing at things and looking concerned. At the end, they agreed there were 3 things they would have done differently. He agreed with 2 of them. They argued about the third until sunset. Nobody won. That meant the design was probably right. Kale left for the valley 3 days after the wall was finished. She took 6 people and a letter of introduction he had not known existed. She had written it 2 years ago. She had been waiting for the wall. He watched her go. Then he turned around. There was a signal tower to build on the northeast ridge. A water system that needed lining. 17 structural modifications to the internal buildings. Each unfinished repair waited behind the wall like a debt coming due. The furnace was nearly hot enough to attempt what he truly wanted to make. There was work to do. There always was. That, he was beginning to understand, was entirely the point. Kale was gone for 19 days. In her absence, he discovered something about himself that he did not enjoy. Against every value he had ever held, he had become management. It started small. Someone asked him where to put the new latrines. He gave a correct answer involving drainage and prevailing wind. The next day, 3 more people came with 3 more questions. A precedent is just a load path for decisions. He tried to give the decisions back. He told them to ask Brent. Bren listened to each question, thought about it carefully, and then pointed at him. Bren, it turned out, was also management. He just had a clearer reporting structure. He finally became the person he had resented throughout his previous life. Instead of answering every question himself, he built a system. He divided the camp into specialized work groups. He put the 4 engineers in charge of the things they understood. He wrote almost nothing down because most people could not read. The 4 engineers had names he could finally pronounce. For the first week, they were in his head, simply foundations. Timber, water, and the quiet one. The quiet one turned out to be the most dangerous. She noticed things. Running a settlement is just structural engineering with worse materials. Loads still concentrate at corners. Failures still start where 2 systems meet, and nobody owns the joint. People are simply a building that argues. The first real build without Kale was the signal tower on the northeast ridge. The blind spot he had stood in for an hour weeks earlier, feeling clever and a little sick. A signal tower is not a watchtower. A watchtower is for seeing. A signal tower is for telling other people what you saw fast, before it stops mattering. Information has a shelf life, especially the bad kind. The ridge was bedrock under a thin skin of soil. You anchored a bedrock differently than you anchored a dirt. Timber wanted to pin it. He wanted to key it into the rock. They argued about it for an entire day. They did both because the ridge gets wind, strong enough to embarrass the storm he had already survived. You drill the rock, set iron keys in molten lead, and pin the timber to the keys. Overkill is just engineering that has met the weather. They built it in 4 days. The signal itself is simple. A shuttered firebox and a set of agreed patterns. 1 long light scouts, 2 soldiers, 3 held, leave now. The question of who owns this ridge has been answered. The answer was no longer them. He made the shutters out of the first sheet metal the new furnace produced. It felt appropriate. The thing that warned them about the future was made by the thing that was the future. Then the cistern, a settlement under siege, dies of thirst before it dies of swords. He had watched it happen in a previous life in case studies with neat little casualty figures. He did not want a case study. Lining a cistern is patience expressed as labor. Layer of clay packed wet, then crushed, fired ceramic worked in. The same trick as the furnace, then more clay. Water does not attack. It simply waits at every seam. You got lazy about. They filled it for the first time from the diverted stream. He watched the water rise against the lining and held his breath at the seams. It held, then it kept holding. Holding, it turns out, is just not failing. Repeated over time. While routing the overflow, the engineer he called Water questioned its oversized channels. She had noticed he kept building beyond the cistern's immediate needs. He told her the cistern was not the only thing that was going to use that stream. She went quiet. In a way, he was learning to respect. Here is the thing he actually wanted to build. The thing. The furnace was almost, but not quite hot enough for, not a weapon. Everyone always assumes it is a weapon, a wheel, a water wheel. Turning a shaft, driving a hammer that never gets tired, and a bellows that never needs to breathe. The single most important thing a backward world is missing is not better swords. It is the idea that a river can do the work of 40 men. The river needed no food, wages, or persuasion. The first version did not work. Naturally, the wheel turned, the shaft turned, and the hammer came down with all the authority of a tired man tapping a table. He had the gearing wrong. Torque and speed are a trade, and he had traded the wrong direction. He sat with it for an evening, calculated the cam profile, and the gear ratio with the stick in dirt by fire, light. The way he now apparently did all his engineering. Somewhere a version of him with a laptop and a heated office was screaming. He told that former version to be quiet. He had never built anything that mattered either. Second version, he changed the gearing and reprofiled the cam. The hammer lifted slowly and dropped fast. Slow lift, fast drop. Store the energy, then spend it all at once. It is, when you think about it, how most important things work. The hammer came down, and the sound it made was not a tap. It sounded like the 19th century clearing its throat. Clearing its throat about 400 years early. Bren watched the hammer work for a long time. Then he set down the sledge he had carried for 11 years. Not dramatically, he just set it against the wall, the way you put down something you no longer need to carry, and he picked up the tongs instead. On the 22nd day, the signal tower lit. 2 lights. Soldiers, not a column. Patrol. But a patrol is a question the Empire asks before it sends a sentence. He climbed the ridge himself, old habit. You verify the data before you act on it, especially when acting on it cost you the only home you have managed to build in a world that did not want you to have one. Down in the valley where the survey team had been, there was now a road, a real one, cut, graded, drained. Good work. He struggled to hate competent engineering, even when it targeted his home. That made the new road more sturdy, not less impressive. Roads come before armies, he had said that weeks ago. Being clever, it is much less satisfying to be proven right about the timeline of your own siege. Kale had been gone for 22 days. The charter had been her plan for 2 years. The Empire's road arrived before her paperwork. He did the only thing the situation allowed. He went back down the ridge and kept building. She returned on the 24th day. 6 people had left with her. 4 came back. He did not ask about the other 2. In front of the camp, he asked later. The answer was the kind you file under the cost of paperwork and do not reread. She found him at the trip hammer, watched it work for a while, the way everyone did. Kale had the charter. She said it plainly, the way she said everything that cost her. They possessed a charter, but the charter carried dangerous obligations. They were on parchment a chartered settlement under a minor noble house, which meant the Empire could not simply clear them. It had to go through House Thrennic. Thrennic had signed for reasons of its own. A charter is a load path. It transfers force. The Empire's pressure no longer landed on them directly, it landed on Thrennic. And House Thrennic, being a small house in reduced circumstances, would transfer that force right back down onto them in the form of obligations, iron, tools. Eventually, when the Empire pushed hard enough, Kale explained the cost without softening it. They had traded the risk of being erased for the certainty of being used. He told her it was a good trade. She looked surprised. He told her that a structure being used is a structure still standing. You can renegotiate loads. You cannot renegotiate with rubble. She almost smiled. The 0.3-second one. He was beginning to be able to predict it, which felt like its own kind of engineering. That night, the 4 engineers, Bren, Kale, and he sat around the trip hammer that was finally quiet. And they did the thing that the Empire with all its roads and surveys and patrols did not know how to do. They planned past the next 90 days. House Thrennic wanted iron and tools. Fine. He had a water wheel that made iron and tools while they slept. The Empire wanted the mountains. Fine. He had a ridge that told them they were coming, and a wall that made their coming expensive. Every demand on the list was a problem he already had a structure for, except one. Kale asked near the end what they would do when House Thrennic asked for men. When the obligation stopped being iron and started being lives. Nobody answered, because that one man was not an engineering problem. He had built a lot of things in 2 lives. Now, bridges that held, furnaces that held, a wall, tower, a wheel. He was good at making things bear loads they were not supposed to bear. He did not yet know how to make that true of people. But the list was long, and the list, as he kept saying, was the point. There was work to do, there always was. But the work was no longer something being done to him. For the first time in either life, it was his. The rider from House Thrennic came 11 days after Kale got back. He did not dismount. In his experience, a man who will not get off his horse is a man delivering something he does not want to be standing next to when you read it. The message was an obligation notice, dressed in the polite language houses use when they are passing pain downhill. The Empire was mustering a force against a neighboring valley. House Thrennic was required to contribute men, and House Thrennic in turn required them from them. There it was, the question nobody had answered 11 days ago, round a quiet hammer. Now, it had a number attached, 40 men. 40 of the people he had spent months teaching to build instead of bleed. He did the math before he did the feeling. He always do. 40 men was a third of everyone here who could hold a line. Sent down the mountain into someone else's valley. For someone else's war, most would not come back. Musters are very good at not giving things back. Kale read his face. Kale recognized his attempts to replace soldiers with iron payments. He admitted it, but she warned that no substitute existed. They are not asking what they are worth. They are asking whether they will kneel. He spent 2 days looking for the way around it anyway, because that is what he was. He drafted the counter offer they would build. House Thrennic a road, supply a year of tools, forge them iron that rang anything but the 40. The quiet one watched him draft it for 2 days. On the second evening, she finally spoke. The quiet one finally identified the flaw in his counteroffer. He was solving forced obedience with an offer of usefulness. She had tried that strategy for 11 years inside the Empire. That failure was precisely why she now lived among outlaws. Usefulness is a currency. Obedience is a different currency. The Empire had politely revealed which currency it accepted. You cannot pay a toll in a currency the gate does not take. The problem could not be solved through usefulness alone. No structure he designed could make forced obedience disappear. He sat with that. It is an uncomfortable thing for a person like him to meet a load that does not care how clever your structure is. Some forces only answer to other forces. They did not get to choose. On the third night, the signal tower lit. 3 lights. Held. Leave now. But then the Empire refused to wait for House Thrennick to deliver them. It was coming to collect in person, not the muster column coming up the new road they had so kindly graded for themselves. He had to admit, a grim professional appreciation. They built the road to take their valley. Now, they were using that same road to conquer them efficiently. Kale started giving orders. This was her language. The way structures were his. He watched her turn a frightened settlement into something, with corners and load paths in about 90 seconds. He finally understood what she had meant weeks ago about leaders not dismantling systems that work. That was when Kale turned to him with the only question that mattered. How expensive can you make the approach? Not a request for a wall. A request for arithmetic, the kind he was good at. Here's what he knew that they did not. The road they had graded crossed the old riverbed. The soft ground he had rerouted his own wall around weeks ago. Saturated clay over a buried channel. Beautiful to drive a cart over. Catastrophic to fight on if it got any wetter. He had spent a month impounding water above that road. The cistern, the diverted stream, the oversized channels. Water had questioned. All of it sitting uphill of that road behind earth. He could open. He had not built it for this. But the best infrastructure does not care what you originally intended. He sent runners to the sluice. Not yet. Timing is the whole weapon. Open it too early, and they see the ground go soft and root around. Open it too late, and they are already through. You wait until the load is committed. Until they cannot back out of their own momentum. The column reached the choke point at the 3rd hour, where the terrain pinched them between the ridge and the old riverbed. Exactly where the geometry of the mountain wanted them. He had not put the mountain there. He had simply read it correctly. They were good, disciplined. They moved through the pinch in order, shields up, expecting the wall. They were entirely prepared for the wall. They were not prepared for the ground. He gave the signal. A single shuttered light from the wall. That was when the runners opened the sluice. A month of impounded water went looking for the lowest place it could find. It found the old riverbed under the road, under the column. The ground did not collapse dramatically. Drama is for theater. It simply stopped being ground. The graded surface turned to a skin over slurry. Boots that had been marching were suddenly knee-deep in the riverbed. That had decided to remember it was a riverbed. A formation is a structure. It has load paths like anything else. It is held together by every man, being able to rely on the man beside him. Take away the footing and the formation does the same thing any structure does when its connections fail. It comes apart at the joints. It was not a battle, not really. Battles are between two forces. This was a force meeting. Physics. Physics never negotiates, retreats, or fears death. It just applies everywhere at once. The wall did the rest, not by killing, by being a thing they could not climb. While they were busy not drowning, Kale held the line at the gate. He had never been more aware of the difference between them. He had made the approach expensive. She made the holding possible. 2 different kinds of engineering. Men still died on both sides. He wanted to be precise about that because it would be obscene not to be. The water did not make it bloodless, it made it brief. Brief is the only mercy that kind of night has to offer. By the 4th hour, what was left of the column was pulling back down their beautiful road, dragging what they could, leaving what they could not. A probe is a question, they had answered it. The answer was not worth it. They lost 9 people. He knew all 9 names. That was new too. In his previous life, the casualty figures in the case studies never had names. That is how you were able to read them over coffee. Bren took a spear through the meat of his shoulder, holding the gate. He was annoyed about it, mostly because it was his sledge arm, and he had only just gotten used to not needing the sledge. He would keep the arm. The healer and he agreed on the treatment. which surprised them both. Foundations did not make it. The engineer who argued with him about bedrock for an entire day on the ridge. He died at the gate, holding a line he had helped design. He kept thinking he would have had opinions about how he was handling the aftermath. He had opinions about everything. It was the best thing about him. The quiet one sat with him afterward. Neither of them said anything useful. She had been right about the obedience and the usefulness. Being right, he was learning, not the same as being comforted by it. Kale found him at the wall as the sun came up. Blood on her, none of it hers. She looked at the approach, at the water already draining back to wherever water goes. At sunrise, Kale told him that he had answered their question. He understood immediately which unresolved question she meant. What would they do when obligations demanded lives instead of iron? The answer was not 40 men marching away for strangers. Men sent down a mountain to die for someone else. The answer was 9 spent defending the thing they had built. He did not know whether that was better. He knew it was different. Some arithmetic does not have a clean remainder. That afternoon, he did something he had not done once in all his months in this world. He wrote something down. 9 names carved into a sheet of the furnace's own iron. With a chisel that started everything. Because almost nobody here can read. And that was exactly the point. Memory is not a load-bearing material. It creeps. It deforms under time. It fails quietly at the joints when you are not looking. Some things are too important to rest on a material that forgets. He carved the names into iron, because iron remembers. Kale watched him hang it by the gate. She did not say it was sentimental. She did not say it was a waste of good iron. She said, now, the next ones will know they were first ones. Which was, he realized, the most structural thing anyone had said to him in either life. Foundations matter because of what gets built on them. The empire would come back. They all knew it. A probe that fails is just data for a larger attempt. He had bought time and made it expensive, and put 9 names in iron. That was what he could do. It was not everything, but it was not nothing. For now, that hard-earned survival was enough. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But he had finally learned the thing. The mountain had been trying to teach him since the wagon went over the edge. You do not build to be finished. You build because the alternative is letting the water in. He was finished letting the water in. They spent the rest of that autumn rebuilding the wall, the gate, the things the water had taken, along with the things it had saved. He told himself the empire would need time to absorb the loss of a column. He was right about that. He was wrong about what they would do with the time. Word came up the mountain in pieces the way all their news did. The empire had not raged. It had not sent a bigger column to be embarrassed by the same riverbed. It had done something far more dangerous. It had gotten curious. An empire that loses a column to a clever local either forgets the place or studies it. Forgetting is cheaper. They were not going to be so lucky. The empire was sending someone to study the settlement instead of crushing it. What no one expected was the chosen specialist was an imperial engineer. For the first time, another engineer threatened the advantage keeping them alive. For most of a year, his advantage came from being completely alone. No one within 100 miles thought in load paths and failure modes. That monopoly on engineering knowledge had protected everything he built. The empire had just decided to send him a mirror and aim it. Kale saw it land on his face. Kale noted he had feared armies for months without showing it. One approaching engineer frightened him more than an entire column. He explained that an army was only a measurable number. An equal engineer was a question without a proven answer. The imperial engineer arrived 11 days later and calmly studied the settlement. Yet he made no immediate move against the wall. He did not attack. An engineer never strikes before reading a structure. Every approach, foundation, and water channel had to be understood first. He built a camp on the far ridge, beyond bowshot, square to the ridge, properly drained, and structurally correct. He could tell the quality of his mind from the drainage of his camp. It was irritatingly excellent. He watched him through the autumn light with the closest thing to dread he had felt since the wagon. The enemy was following the exact process he would have used. He walked the approaches. He looked at the riverbed for a long time. Then he looked up the slope at the high ground, where his impounded water had to be. He knew with sick certainty that the enemy had found the reservoir. He sent men to confirm it, not to attack, to measure. A small party walked the old riverbed in daylight, openly, taking the soil in their hands and looking up the slope, at exactly the earthwork that held his reservoir. They were not hiding. He wanted him to know that he knew. Engineers communicate by demonstration. That evening, a single arrow came over the wall, no message tied to it. Just the arrow placed precisely in the center of the open yard, where everyone could see it had been a choice and not a shot. It is the most articulate thing anyone has ever not said to him. It meant he can reach you. He was choosing not to attack. Yet, he walked out and picked it up. The fletching was perfect. The shaft was straight to a tolerance this world did not usually bother with. Even his arrows were well made. He had never wanted so badly to dislike a man he had not met. Bren, his arm still in a sling, looked at the arrow and then at him. He said one of the maybe 40 words of his language he now understood. Careful from a man who had watched him survive a cliff, a bridge, and a flood. Bren never wasted words, especially when danger could speak for itself. That single warning told him exactly how seriously to take the man on the far ridge. He set the arrow down and began counting every resource they still possessed. The next morning, he began to build, not a camp, a road toward them, properly graded, properly drained, with cut-off ditches that would carry any water he sent at it harmlessly into the valley. He was answering the riverbed before he could even use it again. His best trick solved in the time it takes to dig a ditch. He sat on the wall and watched his single greatest advantage become irrelevant, one shovelful at a time. It is a particular kind of loneliness watching someone take apart your best idea, because they are smart enough to have had it too. He had been the future dropped into the past for a year that had been enough. But the Imperial Engineer was not the past. He was the present. Fully realized every hard lesson the Empire had learned about taking walls down. Standing on a far ridge, pointed at his. He was not fighting a backward world anymore. He was fighting a competent one. He stopped trying to win through clever tricks. Cleverness is what you use when you were the only smart person in the room. He was in the room now against an equal. You do not win with tricks. You win with the thing he does not have. He possessed one advantage the Imperial Engineer lacked. Time, not more of it, less need of it. He had to bring everything up that mountain. Every tool, every beam, every nail, hauled from an empire a long way away. He had a river that made iron and tools while they slept. He had to be supplied. He had a wheel. A siege is a race between two exhaustions. The besieger runs out of supply, patience, or season. The besieged run out of food, water, or walls. He could not outfight him, but he might be able to outlast him if he could make the settlement need less of everything than his army needed of anything. While his rival built a road, he built redundancy. A second cistern, lined and hidden, in case he took the first grain store split across 4 locations because a single store is a single point of failure, and he had buried enough single points of failure to know better. You do not defeat a siege. You make yourself expensive to starve. He noticed every defensive adjustment they made. One afternoon, his surveyors mapped the smoke from his forge, timing how long the furnace ran. He measured whether their defenses could grow faster than his siege advanced. He had the strange experience of being read as accurately as he was reading. They never spoke. They did not have to. Every ditch he dug was a sentence. Every store he hid was a reply. It was the most honest conversation he had experienced in either life. Conducted entirely through earthworks across 400 meters of contested mountain. Here's what he understood that he could not. He thought he was besieging a fortress, a fixed thing, a wall with people behind it, waiting to run out. But he had not built a fortress. He had built a machine that made the things it needed to survive. You cannot starve a thing that feeds itself. It was the one idea his entire excellent education had not prepared him for. Every fortress he had ever reduced was a consumer. His was a producer. He was the best siege engineer the Empire had. His settlement produced the tools, water, and repairs needed for survival. No conventional siege could defeat what he had built. He adjusted within a week. That is what frightened him most. Not that he was good, but that he was fast. He stopped trying to wall them in. Instead, the Imperial Engineer moved to cut off the stream, feeding them. He moved up the slope toward the water. That ran his wheel and filled his cisterns. If he could not starve the people, he would starve the machine. It was the correct move. He hated how correct it was. The wheel was the heart of everything he had built. The wheel's weakness was that its heart occupied one visible location. His rival found that weakness before he finished pretending it did not exist. That left him with 2 choices, and neither was comfortable. He could defend the stream on ground the enemy had already chosen. Good men would die there for terrain that offered them nothing. Or he could redesign the machine before the stream was taken. He chose the second option, because defending a weakness only delays failure. A real engineer removes the weakness before the enemy can exploit it. He ordered the team to rebuild the wheel around a smaller internal flow. Rainwater from the roofs would feed the second cistern and return downstream. That closed loop no longer depended on the stream above the settlement. The redesigned wheel would produce less power, but less was still survival. Under siege, reduced output beat a machine that stopped completely. If the Empire cut the stream, the forge would slow, not die. That difference could decide whether the settlement survived the winter. When his men finally reached the stream and dammed it, expecting to watch his forge go cold, it did not go cold, it got quieter. He did not pretend he had not stood on the wall and enjoyed that. It was petty. It was also the most satisfying engineering he had ever done. Spite is an underrated design constraint. From the far ridge, he saw him stop, stand at his new dam, looking down at smoke that should not still be rising for a long time. He would give a great deal to know what he wrote in his report that night. He liked to think it was the same word Bren had used, careful. He did not get angry. Engineers make mistakes, and he did not make mistakes. He simply revised his estimate of how long they would take and kept building. That is the thing about a competent enemy. You cannot frustrate him into folding. You can only make the bill longer than he is willing to pay. The Imperial engineer made his move, or rather, the Empire made it through him the way it made all its moves through smaller things. A messenger came up the mountain under a white cloth with an offer. The settlement could live if it handed over two things. The first thing was the furnace. All of it, the wheel, the methods, the knowledge of how iron was made to ring. They called it in the message the devil work, which he found a little rich, coming from the people who had graded a road specifically to murder a valley. The second thing was him. The message did not use his name. It did not know his name. It called him the foreign engineer and asked that he be delivered to the Empire alive for questioning. He had been wanted for many things in 2 lives. He had never before been wanted for being good at his job. The yard went very quiet when Kale read it aloud. 140 people doing the arithmetic he had taught them. 2 lives, his, and a machine's against all of theirs. It is an ugly sum. He had never resented a piece of clean mathematics more. He did the only honest thing. He told them to consider it. Seriously, he stood in the yard and laid out the trade. In the plainest terms, he had, the same way. He laid out a load calculation. A choice this large required facts, not sentiment. It should be made on full information, even when the information includes the price of his own neck. Brent spoke first. He stood up, slinging all, and said something short in his own language, and then for his benefit found the words in his. Bren offered one simple argument. The engineer had stayed after freedom came. Then Bren sat down, considering the matter completely settled. That single truth was enough for everyone present. She said votes were for questions people disagreed about. She looked around the yard at 140 faces. She saw the answer hidden behind his fear. Every face in the yard had already rejected the Empire's bargain. The message went back down the mountain with 2 words. He never asked which 2. Kale's mouth told him they were not polite ones. But then the Imperial engineer answered by taking the northeast ridge. He took the ridge, his ridge, the northeast spur with the signal tower, the one he had built, feeling clever and a little sick. He took it in a single cold dawn, methodically, the way he did everything. They could not hold it. It was always going to be his. The moment he decided to pay for it, they lost 4 more people, taking too long to give it up. His fault. He had built the tower to be defensible. Defensible structures are difficult to abandon, even when retreat is correct. He had engineered a place worth dying for in the wrong direction. Sentiment is a load he kept forgetting to calculate. From the ridge he now owned, he could see everything. Their stores, their second cistern, the rebuilt wheel, the count of their people. He had taken the high ground in every sense. And then he did the thing that told him finally exactly who he was dealing with. He stopped. He did not press the assault. He had the ridge, the high ground, the better supply, and a settlement he had spent a season learning by heart. And he stopped and looked at the cost of the final step, and decided it was too high to take this year. A lesser man would have spent his army to finish it. He spent patience instead. He had never been so respected by anyone trying to destroy him. That he understood at last was the difference between them and a column of frightened men. He was not trying to win a battle. He was trying to take a place intact for the least cost. He had decided they cost too much this autumn. He would winter on the captured ridge and return in the spring with a bill they could not pay. On the first night of the siege proper, a single arrow came over the wall again. This one carried a message written in the trade tongue. The handwriting was as precise as the engineer's perfect fletching. 3 words waited on the page. Fine work, Spring. He understood completely. It is the only correspondence he had ever received from someone who understood exactly what he had built and intended to take it apart anyway. They had lost the ridge, the stream, the tower, and 13 people across the whole campaign whose names were now in iron by the gate. They had kept the settlement, the furnace, the wheel, and the winter. He did the arithmetic the way he did. It did not balance. It never does. But it was, for one more season, survivable. Survival itself had become another kind of victory. That night, he climbed what was left of their wall. He looked across the valley at enemy fires burning on his ridge. 2 engineers on 2 cold hills, who had spent a season reading each other's minds in mud and water and stone. He had spent a year being the only person in this world who thought the way he did. Finally, another mind like his existed in this world. He was the enemy. It was God help him. It was, God help him, the least alone he had felt since he arrived. The war was no longer between an empire and a camp. It was between 2 people who understood load paths on a mountain. That would in the end hold whichever of them built better. He did not love his odds. He had more of everything. But for the first time, he respected his opponent. A respected opponent is still company you are trying to kill. Spring was 4 months away. He had a furnace that rang, a wheel that turned, 136 people who had refused to trade him for their own safety, and a worthy enemy who would be back the moment the pass is clear. There was, as ever, work to do. But for the first time in either life, he was not dreading the next problem. He was already designing the answer. Winter on a besieged mountain is 4 months of 2 armies staring at each other and pretending the cold is the real enemy. His fires on his ridge, his forged smoke in the valley. Beneath the pretense, both sides kept building. He was building a siege train. He was building geometry. Everyone expected him to build the wall higher. Taller walls are what you build when you do not understand why walls fail. Walls do not fail because they are short. They fail because there is a place the attacker can stand where the wall cannot answer him. A blind spot, a dead angle. Height does not fix a dead angle. He had watched armies learn that lesson on walls for taller than his. He refused to make the wall taller. He built out low, thick, angled earthworks pushed forward from the wall in pointed shapes, each point covering the face of the next. Every position an attacker used would be exposed to another defensive face. No dead angles, no blind spots. A shape with no safe place to be. It is a shape that will not be invented. Where he come from, for a few hundred more years. It does not look like a fortress. It looks like a flattened star pressed into a hillside. Ugly, low, wrong. To anyone who knows what a castle is supposed to look like. And absolutely lethal to anyone who tries to walk up to it. Bren did not understand it at first. He looked at his low, ugly earthworks, and asked in his blunt way, why? He had built a wall a child could climb. He led Bren to one point of the new earthwork. There, he asked Bren to imagine, standing directly before the angled face. Then he pointed at the 2 other points that could both reach him. There, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said a word he had not taught him. He was fairly sure it was a compliment. The quiet one understood immediately. She walked the whole trace once in the snow, saying nothing. Then she found him, and said, there is nowhere to stand. He said that was the entire idea. She said, the Empire does not know this shape, he said. Not yet. Neither of them said the obvious next thing, that after this, they would. They finished the trace in the last week of winter, banked earth faced with stone low enough that a siege engine stones would mostly pass over or bury harmlessly in the slope angled. Every approach crossed the firing angle of another defensive face. It was the best thing he had built in this world. It was also, he suspected, the most dangerous idea he had ever let out of his head. Until spring arrived, then the Empire returned with the full siege train. The bill arrived. It was larger than he had let himself imagine. Not a column, not a probe, a siege train. The kind an empire assembles when it has decided that a place will be taken. And the only remaining question is the price. Trebuchets broken down and hauled up the road. The Imperial engineer had graded for exactly this. Sappers, ladders, and towers. Thousands. where before there had been hundreds. He stood on his low, ugly earthwork, and watched an empire's full attention arrive in his valley. It is a humbling thing to be taken seriously by something that large. Kale stood beside him. Neither of them pretended it was anything other than what it was, she said. Last autumn, they sent a question. This spring, they sent an answer. He warned that the imperial answer assumed they remained unchanged. But the settlement no longer had last autumn's vulnerable shape. Flattened star pressed into the hill and almost smiled. He would not lie about the fear. He had built the best defense this world had ever seen. And it was still 136 people behind a clever shape against an empire that had decided to spend whatever it took. Confidence in your engineering and fear for your life are not opposites. He had learned to hold both. You design with the first. You stay awake with the second. The imperial engineer took 3 days to position, methodical as ever. He watched him place his engines, and felt a strange sick pride. He was placing them correctly. Textbook for a fortress, for a wall, for the shape his settlement used to be. He had not yet understood that he had changed the question. His textbook assumed every fortification possessed a front. A face, you batter. A wall, you breach. A gate, you rush. His trace did not have a front. It had only flanks. Every approach was the flank of something else. He had brought the perfect tools for a problem he had spent the winter deleting. On the third evening, the engine stopped moving. He knew what that meant. He had finished positioning, and then he had actually looked at what he was positioning against. Truly looked the way he had looked at the riverbed, and he had seen the shape. No assault came that night or the next. He sent no men to die, learning what he already knew. Instead, he did the most unsettling thing he could have done. He sent surveyors to map his earthwork carefully, and respectfully. He had stopped trying to take his fortress. He shifted from attacking the fortress to understanding its underlying idea. That was the moment he understood the real stakes. Higher than the settlement, higher than his life. He had built a shape that defeated everything his world knew about taking a wall. He was skilled enough to recognize, study, and copy the design. He had not just built a defense. He had handed the future its next weapon to both sides at once. Kale saw the look on his face. She asked what was wrong, since by every visible measure they were winning. He told her that some victories teach the loser how to win the next one. She thought about that, then she said the most structural thing he had ever heard. Then they had better be the kind of people worth copying. He had never had a better answer to a problem he could not solve. He probed once, he had to. A real engineer confirms the model before he abandons a plan. A single careful assault on the face that looked weakest. It was not weakest. There is no weakest face. That is the point of the shape. He gave the order to let the geometry work, not to be brave. Bravery is what you need when your design is bad. His design was good. He just needed the people in it to trust the angles more than their fear. Hold your point. Cover the next point's face. Let the shape do what the shape was built to do. They came up the face in good order, discipline, shielded, expecting the wall to be the dangerous thing. The wall was not the dangerous thing. The two flanking points were the dangerous thing. The attackers entered the overlapping fields of both flanking points. There was no single killing blow. There never is. In good engineering, there was just no safe place. Every man who reached the face was already being answered from two sides he could not shield against at once. A shield stops one direction. His trace did not offer them the luxury of one direction. They were brave. He wanted that recorded. They came on into a shape. That gave them nothing because their discipline told them to. Discipline is a beautiful and terrible thing. It will carry good men directly into geometry. That does not care how brave they are. The imperial engineer pulled them back fast, faster than pride should have allowed because he was not fighting for pride. He was confirming a model, and the model had just been confirmed. His probe told him exactly what he already knew. There was no cheap way in. No approach offered the empire an acceptable price. They lost 6 people on the faces that day. They went into the iron by the gate that evening. While the names were still the only writing in the settlement, 19 now. He carved them himself, the way he had carved all of them. It does not get easier, he had decided it is not supposed to. The attackers lost far more. He made himself look at the slope below his beautiful geometry the next morning. A designer must have the courage to witness what his creation does. He studied everybody below and accepted the cost without excuses. He had built the most efficient defense this world had seen. Efficiency in defense is just a polite word for how good your shape is at killing. He did not look away, he owed them that at least. Bren found him there, he did not offer comfort. He had buried too many people to insult him with it. He stood beside him and looked at the same slope. Bren observed that the Empire would have acted with less care. The statement was true, although it offered no comfort. It was true. It did not make him feel better. He did not expect it to. He just did not want him looking at it alone. Then a rider crossed the battlefield under white cloth with an unexpected invitation. This rider served the Imperial Engineer, not House Thrennic. The message was not a demand. It was an invitation. He wanted to meet the two of them on the open ground between his engines and his star, where neither of them could pretend the other was just a shape on a map. Kale did not want him to go. She pointed out correctly that he was the one thing the Empire had asked for by description, that walking onto open ground was handing them the chance to simply take what they had besieged a valley for. He told her she was right about the risk and that he was going anyway because there was one thing he wanted more than he wanted to be safe. He wanted to meet the only other person in this world who thought the way he did. They met at midday, halfway between his lines and his. No weapons. He had brought, instead of a sword, a leather case of drawing instruments. He understood the message immediately. He was telling him what kind of meeting this was. Not a negotiation between enemies. A conversation between engineers. He was older than him, gray, where he was only getting there. A face like a man who had spent 30 years solving the problem of how to take strong places from people who did not want to give them up. He looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked back at his star fort, and he said in careful trade tongue. The Imperial Engineer finally asked who had taught him that defensive shape. He answered honestly, because deception would have insulted them both. Nobody taught him here, because the design came from another world. There it was old knowledge, but in this realm it arrived early. He thought he already suspected the only kinds of answers that fit. He just nodded slowly, the way you nodded the thing that explains a great deal. They talked for an hour about the shape. He had questions, the good kind. The kind only someone who has tried to take a 100 walls down can ask. He answered them honestly. He did not fully know why. Maybe because in 2 lives, he was the first person to ask him about his work as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. To him it was. To him, it always had been. Then he told him why he had really asked to meet, not to learn the shape. He had already learned it from the outside in 3 days. He had asked to meet because he had a recommendation to make to the Empire, and he wanted to look him in the eye before he decided what it would be. The Imperial Engineer admitted that he could eventually take the settlement. The defender did not argue, because the assessment was accurate. However, victory would cost 1/3 of the attacking force. It would also consume a season and spread the design everywhere. Others would copy the fortress, forcing the Empire to face it repeatedly. He had seen all the way to the bottom of it, further maybe than he had wanted to. He understood that taking his fort meant teaching the world his fort. But then the Imperial Engineer offered recognition instead of destruction. He said the Empire wanted the mountain productive, stable, and obedient. A ruin would provide none of those benefits. He said a place that could not be cheaply taken was a place worth treating with instead, and that he would recommend exactly that, recognition. A border, Assel's charter, real this time, from the Empire, and not just from Thrennic. If he came with him, the Imperial Engineer said it plainly, the Empire would give him what this mountain never could provide. Materials, men, scope. 1,000 walls to build instead of 1 to defend. He was not threatening him, he was, in his austere way, offering him the one thing he thought a builder could not refuse, more to build. He had to admit it. The offer pulled at him because he was a builder. He had spent a year making bricks by hand, and bridges out of fraying rope, and a furnace out of mud. Here stood a man offering him an empire's supply of proper materials. It would be a lie to say it did not pull at him for about 3 seconds. Then he thought about 19 names and iron by a gate, and the pull stopped. He told him no. He told him that he did not build walls. He built this one for these people, that a structure is not just its geometry, it is what it holds up, and that everything worth holding up in either of his lives was currently standing behind a flattened star on a cold hill. He listened, then he nodded again, the same slow nod. He said he had expected that answer. He said that refusal was exactly why he would recommend recognition. Only someone rooted there could make the settlement dependable. A man who refused to abandon his creation had built something worth preserving. Destroying that loyalty would cost the empire more than recognizing it. He gathered his instruments, he shook his hand once, the way engineers do briefly, and like they are checking a joint. He returned to his lines to end a siege he had already won. He had already won by choosing not to win it. The siege train withdrew methodically over the next 9 days. He watched the engines come down off the road. He had built to destroy them, and felt the strangest grief. He was losing the only person in this world who understood what he had made. He was the enemy, he was leaving. He missed his enemy before the man had even left. The recommendation went to the empire under his seal. It came back as a charter, a real one this time. Not House Thrennick's frightened paper, but an imperial border drawn around a mountain that had made itself too expensive to erase. On parchment, they were finally a recognized place. It was small, but real, with a recognized border and binding charter, a name the empire had been forced to learn. He hung the charter by the gate, next to the iron with the 19 names. Kale pointed out that he had put the document they want beside the people it had cost, and he supposed she was right. A charter is only worth the names you paid for it. He wanted anyone who read the one to have to look at the other. They had started as a failing bandit camp on a muddy cliff, a place the world was actively trying to delete, and they had become through a year of bridges and furnaces, and walls and water, and one very ugly star pressed into a hill. It had become a place the world was forced to acknowledge. Not through swords, through engineering, through being too well built to be worth the cost of breaking. There is still work to do. There is always work to do. The empire that learned to grade a road will learn to build a star. He would need to design whatever could defeat the next star fort. Their conflict had become an endless conversation in earthworks. Each new defense would force the empire to invent a better answer. But for tonight, the passes are closed. The furnace rings. For once, the list of names beside the gate was not growing. He had built a place that holds. He had built a place that held, and for tonight, that was enough.